Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who will share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. Okay, welcome back to American Medieval. I am Matthew Gabriel, your host, and with us today is Roland Betancourt, who is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery, and is also the Chancellor's Professor of Art History at UC Irvine. It's good to see you again, Roland. Welcome to the show.
I'm so glad to be here.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us. So one of the things that I like to do, just to kind of kick things off, is ask maybe what's a silly question, but I think that it's something that historians of all stripes, or really, not just historians, but anybody who studies the past thinks about. And that's about time machines.
Okay.
So let's take for a moment that we have a time machine, and the time machine has been given to you, Roland, and you get to go back in time to tell a young childhood version of Roland Betancourt that you will grow up someday to study the Middle Ages in some way, the Byzantine Empire or the Middle Ages kind of generally. How does childhood Roland react to that news?
I want to say that he'd be scared and also slightly depressed, probably. But that is my sincere. I did not think this is where this question was going. I thought we were going to be traveling back in time.
Oh, we're totally out of left field.
To a moment.
Yeah, I have no idea what I'm doing. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think he'd be a little confused and disturbed and probably a little depressed. It's like, oh, I thought we were going to do something cooler.
Okay. Well, what did childhood Roland think he was going to do then? Is that a fair question?
I think he wanted to be like an actor or something like that. Something really stereotypical. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to be first baseman for the New York Yankees.
Yeah, exactly.
Didn't work out. Yeah.
These things that are obvious,
Yeah.
So I think that would definitely be confusing. Although young Roland always liked writing. So I think that would comfort him at least, since that is much of our day-to-day.
So there was a lot of writing, but there wasn't a lot of thought for young Roland. And, and when I've asked this question in the past, everybody's thinking kind of a different age, right? Like sometimes 8, 12, 6, whatever, and kind of whatever it is. But there was nothing about the Middle Ages or history or anything like that that kind of enchanted young Roland.
Not really. I think it was just more, other than like the passing fascinations of like, what pop culture might have thrown my way, but I was never really specifically a Middle Ages person. I think I had other interests. I sort of stumbled on the Middle Ages later on.
Okay. Well, then I have to ask, was there a historical period that was interesting to you? And that's fine. There's lots of people who are not interested in the past, and I feel really sorry for them, but they're out there. But was there another period of the past, or maybe another way to frame the question, how did you get to that place? So my mom was an American history middle school teacher. So we went to every Civil War battlefield on the East Coast at some point during my childhood. I, as opposed to my brother and sister, actually enjoyed that. But, I didn't end up going into kind of American history. So, is there anything that kind of got you pulled back into the Middle Ages or just into the past generally?
Well, in some ways, I think this question answers what was my challenge of picking what period of history I was going to specialize in, because I grew up very much in a museum-going household. And so we went to a lot of museums.
Okay.
And that was really one of the things that the story was that my mom used to basically lecture baby Roland about the Mona Lisa and art history because she thought it was something useful to know when I was still in the car seat in the back. And so my aunt always says that she was not surprised when I became an art historian. And she was like, what were you expecting, mother?
Fair enough.
You thought I was going to do something else? And so that was also honestly one of my difficulties. I knew I wanted to be an art historian, but I didn't know what period I wanted to specialize in. And I knew I had to pick one. And so the Middle Ages really came as a sort of multiple choice, just pick one at the very last minute, quite honestly. And so there was much more of a commitment to sort of an art historical world, I think, there.
Okay.
And so I know that the exhibits that I was most excited about were ancient Egypt and, all the things that kids would be into in that sense. But yeah, so I think that that's really part of it. I've always been really more oriented toward the art history side of things more broadly than specifically the Middle Ages.
Well, that's certainly been borne out, I think, by your publication history, right? Is that, you are interested in, and that's one of the kind of really, really wonderful things about the work that you've published, both for academics and for, more popular audiences, that it does span periods,
Mhm.
right? Because, all historians, and when I say historians, you understand, right? Like, I mean, kind of people who study the past kind
Yes.
of generally. I'm betraying my own disciplinary interests, but when I say that, you're all really historians anyway.
Yeah,
But, we know periodization is kind of false and it's like really problematic. And sometimes, themes are some things that kind of interest us, right? So,
completely. And I think that one of the things in particular about the challenge of being an art historian is that you tell people I'm an art historian and then they're immediately like assuming that you do art and all this. And it's a lot easier to say, especially I think as a medievalist, where, art criticism is not something you do on the side in any capacity. It's much easier to just be like, I'm a historian. That really captures more of like what our day-to-day life is like.
yeah.
And so it is one of the sort of interesting aspects also about having picked the Middle Ages that I unwittingly didn't realize how much beyond the history of art I would actually be imbricated in.
Mm.
I did not think that liturgical studies and things like that would be things that I would know intimately well in my career.
Yeah, it's weird how and unexpected initially, but now it's just kind of old hat, right?
Mhm.
Is that how you just get pulled into learning kind of all sorts of field and how any study, especially of, the medieval world kind of broadly conceived, right? Is it makes you an interdisciplinary scholar, I think, right?
Completely. You really can't do it otherwise.
No, you can't do it otherwise because, art doesn't just kind of sit in an altarpiece or something like that. Like it is created by people. It functions as an object, within daily life and things of that nature. So I am curious though. I want to go back to something, if you don't mind. You mentioned it's kind of easier to say you're a historian than an art historian. Like when I say I'm a historian or I'm a medievalist or something like that, right? There's kind of stock answers that I'm ready because I know kind of what people are going to say to me. What do people ask when you say that you're an art historian?
It really depends. It really goes all over the place as to what people might answer. It usually involves me having to backpedal and trying to explain I'm basically just do history because I usually get the answer. It's like, oh, are you an artist? And it's like, absolutely not.
Ah, okay, okay, okay.
Absolutely not. I have zero artistic skill to the point that it's probably an impediment to my work as an art historian. Um, so it's usually that assumption that somehow you do something art related.
That you're a practitioner in some
Yes,
way.
in
Yeah, okay.
some capacity. And I think oftentimes there is also the assumption that if you're an art historian, you're working on something contemporary, which is to be expected.
Sure.
And it's a little bit more tricky when you literally work on a world that no one's ever heard of for the most part. And so it's always like, I do medieval art history. And it's always like, okay. But if I say
Yeah.
Byzantine art, like only in very particular circles will that go anywhere.
Yes. Yes. And I think for the benefit, I should say, of our listeners, right? I think maybe we should explain kind of what the Byzantine world kind of is, right? So I will be the churlish person at the cocktail party. Roland, it's so nice to meet you. What in the world is the Byzantine Empire? I have never heard these words before.
Exactly. Recently, somebody asked me, oh, Byzantium, is that related to Byzantine things that are Byzantine? I was like, yes. And they were like, I've never heard about Byzantium. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I love that you know Byzantine, but not Byzantium, which is an interesting thing.
Yeah.
So, the Byzantine Empire, to put it very bluntly and very simply, can roughly span in the most narrow definition from the year 330 CE to about 1453 with the foundation and the conquest of Constantinople, modern day Istanbul.
Okay.
It is the Eastern Roman Empire. I like to just refer to it as the Roman Empire because that's how they envision themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, no Eastern qualifier. And essentially, one of the key things that I like about the Byzantine Empire is that they spoke primarily Greek, particularly in later periods. And therefore, that means that they had a sort of unfettered access to the history of ancient philosophy and, of course, the biblical text as well. And theology written around it. And so, therefore, it preserves a very interesting vision of Christianity and antiquity that is quite unique to what we see in the Western Latin Middle Ages.
And it's interesting that you mentioned languages, because when I was a young, pluckish undergraduate who decided maybe I want to do this grad school thing and make a terrible life choice and decide to be a professor in this day and age, and I thought maybe I wanted to be a Byzantinist, and then my advisor very smartly, wisely listed off the languages that I would need to at some point at least have a glancing familiarity with, and that turned me off. So
Yeah.
because it really is, right? Like, I mean, that's the thing about the Byzantine Empire. It's not just Greek, right? Like, it encompasses all sorts of other traditions throughout kind of what's known today as the Middle East.
Yeah.
And so you have Armenian and Syriac, and you got to know some Latin because, they knew Latin as well, right? And then you have Greek and maybe some Bulgarian and all sorts of stuff. And that's not even counting kind of the modern scholarship, which is kind of touching on this period as well. So hats off to you, sir.
Thank you. I mean, it's exhausting just thinking about it.
It is, but incredibly rewarding, I would think, too, right? Like, because, I mean, one of the things that, your work is oftentimes focused on, again, in talking about kind of interdisciplinarity and stuff, and not just kind of art history or anything like that, are issues, for example, of gender, right? That have moved kind of beyond it. You have a really wonderful recent book, not your most recent book, we'll get there in a minute, but a really wonderful book about kind of secrecy, in the Byzantine Empire. So, like, kind of, can you walk us through kind of what attracted you to that particular topic? Like, how did you move between these really interesting and very diverse topics and kind of get to kind of where you are now?
Yeah, I always like to say that I just go where the questions take me. And so I'm asking questions and seeking answers. And so that sometimes leaves you in very unruly and unexpected places.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that in opposition to someone who might be very oriented around a particular period or grounded very much in a particular dynasty, medium, especially in art history that happens. You work on sculpture, you work on painting, things like that.
Mm,
Or in the Middle Ages in particular, like with medieval studies, you might work on manuscripts and that's what you do.
sure.
I really have sort of followed these questions, and I thought that the sort of idea of secrecy was a very helpful way of negotiating our relationship to history as well. Like, what is something that really seduces us about history? This idea that you are revealing something that nobody knows, the idea that you're learning something that your neighbor doesn't know and that you can therefore one up them in some capacity. I think that this idea of something that is unknown, purposely concealed or not, is something that is very much critical in our world today, especially in how we think of the transmission of information, conspiracy theories, all these types of intersecting questions. And so for me, it was a sort of a thought experiment about how to consider different ways in which questions of secrecy emerge in even objects and texts that, we sort of assume are not really embroiled in those types of conversations.
Yeah. It's really, and I don't know what your experience is kind of when you're teaching, talking with students, or even just kind of when you're, again, talking with churlish people like me at a cocktail party. But there is this weird kind of split, right, in the way people think about the past, especially not scholars, I should say, in that history is both transparent and impossible to decode in some ways, meaning that it is a succession of memorizable names and dates and events that kind of pass through history, which are, you can just look on Wikipedia, which a lot of people do, right? I do when I need to look up a date. But at the same time, that there's something kind of hidden about it, that there's something kind of kept, that there's a truth underneath it. And I don't know if that's just kind of my experience, but it seems like historians are taken seriously and also kind of dangerous in that way, right? In the popular imagination.
Oh, the popular imagination of historians. That's a great conversation in its own right.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that is sort of the challenge, where I think that in some ways people assume that historians are people who have the Wikipedia uploaded into their brains,
Hmm.
and that's all they are. So I feel like in the cocktail party, the family reunion, maybe that's the more unruly type setting, the family
Fair
reunion.
enough. Yeah.
I think those settings, I think when you say that you're a historian, it's basically like, what date was this? And it sort of becomes the
Mm,
Wikipedia type thing where I'm like, I don't know, check Wikipedia.
yeah.
I can give you better sources, more reputable sources maybe that have more assurance. I know where to find that information, but I'm not going to rattle off every date. And so I think that that's something also which creates like a very high degree of like, we would refer to as like a very positivistic type scholarship, where it's like
Hmm. Hmm.
the who, what, when, where, why of history in a very sort of narrow way. And then there's, I think, the more complex nuance of history, which is what you're not going to find on Wikipedia,
Hmm.
or you'll find like the weird, slightly outdated thing, which is not necessarily factually incorrect, but it's just not how we think about something anymore, or for decades, or sometimes centuries. And so I think that's a lot of the ways in which I think historians, like the popular imagination of historians and like what we do, definitely varies. And I think about this a lot as an art historian in particular, which is like a lot of our role is precisely in making comprehensible the things that are not immediately present
Yeah.
in what is there. And I think that that really is our strength. It's sort of an act of like bringing all that's not just sort of factually present. And sometimes even a date can be a very difficult topic in our world. It often is for the most part.
Yeah. Yeah. Oftentimes those things are contested. I like the way that you put it. I mean, it seems to me that a lot of what, anyone who works on the past kind of does is talks about process,
Mhm.
maybe more than you might otherwise expect, and like how to bring people along to understand a source, for example, be
Yeah.
that written, visual, or kind of whatever. And not just to kind of understand it within its particular context, but understand kind of, well, what is this source doing? How is it created? We need to understand the full context in order to really develop, like, okay, so as you said, kind of a date, like this source says this source says that. How do you reconcile those kinds of differences, right? When you were writing the book on secrecy, too, I mean, one of the things that it was really, really wonderful at doing was demonstrating how important secrecy was in the past as well. Another one of those kind of nice ways in which your work kind of transcends kind of easy periods. Like, was there anything that kind of surprised you about kind of the topics? Because you've been working on this period and this stuff for a long time. Like, was there anything that was unexpected about when you were doing this type of work that kind of really stood out to you?
I think in some ways it was like a question of method. Like I was happily surprised of how useful thinking of secrecy was in sort of approaching processes and systems in whether it be historically or in works of art, that I think we have a whole nother set of questions or terms to describe it. But I think secrecy sort of adds a certain tension, especially that idea that something is concealed purposely, and that
Mm,
really, I think, sort of allowed this bridge between having conversations about not only how a box containing important relics of Christ is concealing something, and there's sort of a poetics of like how it gets revealed. Suddenly, secrecy allows you to think a little bit about not only that sort of dynamic of like revelation and concealment, but I think then also the questions of like, how do we think about the purpose of this object? Is it something that we historiographically have kept secret? Sometimes from not intentionally, but just from like the ways in which we think about it or sort of presented it. So I think it was a very useful way of thinking across time about the ways in which we handle materials and also the way that objects sort of speak for themselves as well.
yeah. There's two things I want to kind of follow up on. And one is about this kind of boogeyman, right? That we all kind of deal with, is about intentionality. Right. Like, how do you think you work with kind of that question about like something being purposefully, in this case, concealed or open in the 12th century, in the 14th century, or something like that? Like, how does that matter? And how do you go about determining that? Because it's a question like I think that we all wrestle with, right?
Yeah, I mean, intentionality is it's a strange one. And the reason why I say that is
Mm,
because one of the things that I've been reflecting on in passing at times is that, I often think of, especially when you're a young scholar or even like an undergrad learning about medieval history, you read these books, especially something that you would read sort of in a lower level class where maybe there's not as many footnotes and everything is more sort of fluidly presented, and you have this sort of presentation of history that's very much like, and then they decided to do this. And we often write with a sort of strong sense of intentionality.
mm,
And especially I think in that process when you start becoming a scholar and you understand that everything must be well argued and sort of substantiated by a footnote, you assume that that intentionality has been clarified every time it is rhetorically used.
yes.
And I'm not someone who would ascribe agency or intentionality when I don't have a footnote to sort of attach to it.
Sure.
But I still assume that that's how sort of the history books that we would read in an undergraduate course were written. And that's really not the case. And it's sort of these moments, especially as someone who's worked with historical chronicles in different capacities, that moment where you begin to realize that a lot of modern history of the Middle Ages has been based on like, well, all the historical chronicles said this. And I'm like, oh, wait, so we're taking that's how we okay, so we're just copying and
We're just trusting
pasting
those guys.
what
Yeah.
someone in the 10th century said an emperor had done. Oh no, we really know nothing. Absolutely nothing. And then it's sort of funny now to like see like there's always the article that's like, well, so and so emperor didn't actually do this because the archaeological evidence proves otherwise. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's like low hanging fruit at this point. Like we know that none of it is potentially real and how it's being described, and especially the intentionality. And I think those are the moments where we have intentionality ventriloquized the most for us in these sort of earlier chronicles that then sort of, is often very complicit with a sort of great men of history narrative, and also the sort of very human-like treatment of empires and sort of political bodies. Like the empire then decided to do this because it was in their best interest for X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And so I think intentionality is something that can be really slippery because we expect it and write it into so much of what we do.
Yeah, and like you said, like it doesn't make kind of cracking history to say like, I don't know why that guy did that. Like maybe he didn't even do it, which is a very real thing that we can say as historians oftentimes, right? So
yeah, and oftentimes I will say that when I write something, and it's not, it maybe sounds like I'm so in control of my prose at all moments in time, and of course, I'm sure there's multiple times when this slips. But I often, when I know that there's something I don't know, I think the question I ask myself is, how do I phrase this so that it's not an incorrect statement? Which is sort of a question of not like not wanting to be wrong. It's more of a question of responsibility. Like, how do I phrase a certain statement when I know that I don't know certain specifics here about how something worked, but you still want to present this sort of plausible connective tissue that is important to the story you're telling? And sometimes it really comes down to just like, how do you express this to a reader to make sure that you're not misrepresenting what the sources say and like what you actually understand to be there?
Yeah, and I think I mean what you seem to be suggesting, right, is that there's an ethics, right, to doing history, right, and to representing the past and to being honest about the past with your readers. And it's not just that oftentimes when there are these kind of cloudy issues of problematic sources, material records that's kind of contradict things, or where there's just uncertainty, it's not just kind of throwing your hands up, but just saying like, we have tools to try to understand the past. This is, for lack of a better term, this is our best guess at kind of what it is. And here's how we arrived at this conclusion, oftentimes, like you said, with a footnote. And then here's it is. Maybe somebody else will find something else. And that's that process of scholarship, right? It's all history is revisionism in some very fundamental sense, right?
And I think one of the things that's really hard about going back to sort of our earlier questions about when you're a historian, what do people assume, is that so much of the challenge, and this is a conversation that I have with a friend who is a computer scientist, and she was complaining that her students did not know the key scene in The Matrix when she was trying to describe a concept in computer science.
Oh yeah, students don't understand The Matrix anymore.
Yeah, exactly. It was an interesting moment for me that I keep talking about, because it was this moment where I realized you teach students how to do what you do. We often teach students the narratives from what we've done, but we don't often teach how we do it. And I think that that's something that's really challenging. And like, I think it's even a challenge in grad school. Like, I think that you learn by doing most of the time, but no one ever sits you down to tell you how to do it. You read methods, but when you think about methods, you read various examples of historical presentations, and then you talk about it, but you don't really ever consider the sort of step-by-step process. And I think that that is one of the things that makes us the most like incomprehensible, because it sort of mystifies. It doesn't mystify. Mystified, at least there would be, I think, an interest. I think it just completely obscures the skill that we have. And we're going to go into the weeds here, but
hey, it's my podcast.
Yeah.
Let's go into the weeds. Yeah.
It was funny. This was actually came up in like my modern research, where I was telling my partner, I buy all these things from like eBay and random things as I'm trying to like hobble together information, but like, I can't just assume that anything, I sometimes don't have a date for something. So therefore I have to use my medievalist skills and determine terminus postquem and terminus antequem, which
Mm-hmm.
are just fancy title, dear listeners, for basically what is the endpoint after which this was created and what is the endpoint before which this had to be created. In
Yeah.
other words, you're saying if you're referring to, I don't know, something that's referencing the end of World War II, that could not have been created before the end of World War II in
That
a
is
sort of feasible assumption.
absolutely, yes.
The Byzantinists love this in terms of earthquakes. If there's mention of an earthquake, eclipses.
Easy place to date something.
We love
Absolutely,
eclipses. If there's a mention of an eclipse, we can figure that out. So these are ways in which you can you oftentimes cannot say absolutely that something has a particular date, but you can say that the author died in 1956 and there's mention of something that happened in 1943. So therefore it has to have happened between 1943 and 1956. When I was describing this, I said, I have to do this when any object that I touch, any source that I touch, I basically have to go through like this process. Fortunately, in my medieval scholarship, there's a lot of work done on these things usually that I'm not having to date something from scratch. But every historian implicitly, in any source they touch, if they don't have a date for it, that's sort of, even if it's believable, even if something has a copyright date on it, that might not be correct. And so you have to sort of go through this process of analysis just to ensure that the information you're dealing with comes from the time it's supposed to come from, or to give yourself a sense where it's coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the type of skills that are completely invisible to most people. And sometimes, like, I raise that example because it's sort of a common sense one. I'm not even talking about learning how to read, the fact that after you learn how to read a medieval language, you then have to learn how to read a variety of different scripts and how the language was written by scribes, which also can help you date things, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Yep.
And so those are, like, I think the harder skills. This is something that I think is very easy to recognize, but it comes in sort of the methods and like the minutia that it takes to do the work we do. And I think that because we present the narratives that where the question of the dating of that random object that you put in a footnote doesn't even come up, really eliminates the very hardcore labor that does happen behind the scenes. And that really is what we do as historians on the day-to-day basis.
Yeah, no, and let me first say, let's just amen, right? Like, so, and I'm thinking about like even the way that graduate training is structured, let alone kind of undergraduate instruction, right? Like in history departments, and I will be discipline specific here, methods and theory are just consigned to like one class. You kind of do it and it's kind of over there. You read some stuff, you don't really reflect on kind of process at all. It's not really a methods course in any real kind of substantive way, oftentimes. And you're just kind of thrown into it and like, well, kind of figure it out, talk to some people, read some things, like figure out all the things you do. But the way that you kind of phrased this earlier is that historians or scholars who work on the past generally like we talk about the things that we have done rather than how we do things. Like that's going to stay with me because that's absolutely 100% almost universally true, right?
Yeah.
And it's a problem, right? Like it creates this idea, as you were saying, that this stuff is transparent. It's easy. Anybody can do it. We have lots of examples, unfortunately, today, like people like just kind of armchair people kind of dipping into things and deciding that I don't have to do any of the work because it's just an easy thing. The humanities are an easy thing to do. And it creates all sorts of problems. And it's one, in some ways, is kind of our own creation.
Yeah, and it's an interesting challenge. And I remember like I was writing an article, it was one of my first articles, and I really wanted to almost share the process of analysis because I thought there is something, I mean, I think that like the process of an analysis can very much be an argument in its own right. And I think that those of our colleagues who are in the sciences who are describing an experiment or like talking about their findings oftentimes include process because it's part of the assessment of the validity of an experiment that's involved. And it really was sort of, I wanted to say like, I did this first and then this happened and then I had to like examine this and that had to be purged from the writing because it was very much like, it was the sense that like, well, this is not how you write things because therefore it's distracting. And it also, beyond being like not how you write things, it becomes this whole thing of like, it almost seems irresponsible because you're sort of walking us through your confusion. And so therefore it lacks the scholarly gravitas of like, let me tell you everything about this object. And I think that that is part of what really exacerbates this challenge. Like, I could just imagine someone, it'd be really great if someone wrote a book on an object that's actually the process of working on the object rather than just the sort of finished, like, here is the story of this object.
Yeah.
It's like, no, that the story is told in the process of doing this research and the extents that you have to go to do this research beyond a Google search.
It is more than a Google search.
It is more than a
So
Google search.
we interrupt this regularly scheduled podcast for some news. For the rest of November, American Medieval and all our sister shows at Multitude are offering 30% off annual Patreon and multi-crew memberships. Think of it as the Black Death Friday sale. We're proud to bring you weekly episodes all year long, but it does mean we need your support all year long. So an annual membership is a great way to do it. Black Friday sucks. Money's tight, and corporations are pressuring small businesses to juice their sales around the holidays. But we, like so many other businesses, need your support all year round. So if you can, support any of the Multitude shows on Patreon. Please spend your money where it counts most and sign up for an annual membership. Just head to patreon.com/American Medieval and use the code ALLYEAR, one word, all caps, at checkout. Then check out our other shows at Multitude. Thanks, and back to the podcast. You know, one of the things that I've learned that David and I have talked about in doing kind of more public-facing writing is that, not so much in the Bright Ages, but in our most recent book, Oathbreakers, is that we really tried to talk about at certain places kind of how we knew what we knew, and about sources and about kind of competing sources and the problems of certain sources and how do you kind of deal with that. And of the feedback that we have gotten from that book, people like that stuff. Like, they're really interested in kind of when you can, going back to secrets, kind of pull back that veil on kind of how you are doing this kind of complicated work. I know Ada Palmer, who's a scholar of the Renaissance, wrote a really good book about inventing the idea of the Renaissance recently. She does the same kind of thing. And again, she's had the same experience too. Readers kind of really like that thing. So although there is this expectation of just kind of a straight, kind of like you were saying, like an authoritative narrative of the things that happened one after another, people do want to hear about process. People are interested in it. And so it would be good for us to talk about it more in some substantive way, I think.
Yeah, and I definitely think that the process is often what is most seductive for people, even in the simple ways, like, oh, you got to actually touch this object. Oh, you actually got to go to France to look at this thing in this random location. And so I think that there's even that aspect where there's almost like the travel log sort of element to what we do, which is really interesting. And I think it's sort of captivating and sort of humanizes also what we do beyond just like the seriousness of it. It also sort of adds the dimensions of like the extents we have to go to answer very simple, at times simple questions that we can't really move beyond sometimes.
Yeah. No, I'm thinking too about like when I was 18 and I did not know what I wanted to do with my life and I was starting college, like I thought maybe I would just be Indiana Jones, right? But it wasn't that like I wanted just a straight kind of narrative of this archaeologist fights Nazis. Like I was enamored of the process by which he, quote unquote, right, did his history. I learned I didn't want to spend as much time like kind of in temples being an archaeologist. And I liked when he was in libraries and reading books. So that's why I moved into those things. But again, like that was process, right?
Yeah.
So,
and also all research is not the same.
No, of course not. Yeah.
Like all research does not involve you going to like the hidden archive to see one object in the ends of the world. Some of the other research is just sitting in the library. And so that is also part of that dynamic, which is like different projects also require radically different hosts of skills, from language skills to everything else. When I'm working on Byzantine liturgical things, like everything's usually in Italian or French. And then if I need to dip into like the Palace of Constantinople, everything becomes German. And it's just, these are aspects of that world. And it also helps you to understand how people find their grooves and also get pushed into certain corners or others because of these various sort of demands that each sort of area or question requires.
Yeah, any project requires you to wear a number of different hats. Like sometimes, like even in the same day, right? Like
Yeah.
you go down a rabbit hole, and then all of a sudden you got to chase this up and start working in a different language or looking at another type of source or something like that. And it's super interesting. So. It seems like an appropriate segue here to talk about maybe your new project, because your new book, which will be coming out in April of 2026, is a departure from the Middle Ages in some ways, because it's about Disney and automation. So I got to ask, I mean, everybody's curious. I'm curious, which is one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show. Like, how did that happen? How did you get to that project from working in the darkest of the dark ages?
It was one of those moments where I think I should begin by prefacing this with the fact that I am a professor at the University of California, Irvine, which is a quick 20-minute drive from Disneyland.
Seems important, right?
Yeah, that's a lot of it.
Yeah.
And a lot of it honestly came back from this project started about 7 years ago when I had just come back from being on leave and I was going back to California, and it was sort of this feeling of like, okay, so what am I going to do here? Like, I don't have any real archives related to what I work on. Like, just you need to do something that feels grounded. I basically wanted to sink my teeth into something that was sort of rich and complex. And a friend of mine who's a great artist, she told me, please come with me to Disneyland. And it sort of started from there. I just thought, okay, this feels difficult enough. And I will say that throughout this process, I have kept saying that this is the most difficult thing I've ever done.
Okay.
And my partner at one point just told me, I've never heard you say that something's hard. And you keep saying this is hard.
Okay.
And I think that's actually been a lot of it. I mean, there's a sort of freedom with medieval stuff where you find your corner, you find your hole, and you sort of dig in. This felt very much, I mean, I think my biggest challenge here was like, how do you do something that doesn't sound utterly boring and pedantic?
You were worried about that with a project on Disney.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Enough.
Disney's challenging. Like, so many people have written on it from so many different angles. It's also not something where there's like an extensive academic body of literature that's sort of particularly hardcore in the fields where I'm in.
It's kind of surprising. Okay.
It's out there in like fan studies and different areas, like social sciences. I have a lot of research, but methodologically, those things are very far afield. And there's like classic work from, particularly the 90s that's there. And then there's all the layers of commentary that accrue beyond that. And so it's a really sort of like, how do you really avoid all of the popular and academic stereotypes as you're working on something like this? And so, of course, I said, I'm going to work on Disney. And as an art historian, as a medievalist, I think it would be very expected for me to do a set number of things. But because of my sort of improv yes and demand on myself, I kept sort of pushing myself like, no, that's not interesting enough. Keep going. And so what I really originally probably thought was going to be some sort of project on, let's say, theming and maybe the Middle Ages in their more sort of stereotypical sense, I got really interested in what was sort of unseen in the parks. And that was in many ways like
secrecy.
Yes. I mean, I guess, yes. I mean, in some ways, very explicitly secrecy.
Yeah.
What I sometimes like to refer to as NDA magic, which is how much of what we call magic is really of a very purposeful secrecy, legal and otherwise. I think I got really seduced by the fact that perhaps one of the things that was most seductive, and I say this all as a Floridian who grew up going to Walt Disney World, is the fact that like when you go to Disney, when you're in a Disney theme park, when you're at Universal Studios, at any sort of very immersive, highly theme park, you sort of are seduced by the idea that it's the theming. But honestly, if you're just walking through something, like if you're going through a walk-through attraction, you're not as excited as when you're actually on a ride. And I began to think, what's the difference between the amusement park ride and, the sort of dolled up ride of a theme park?
Sure.
And I think it was really what I started thinking of, like, it was the sort of sublimation of the automation, like the fact that you're in this sort of immersive space, and yet there's certain jerks and bobs and movements that you experience on these attractions that are very unique to a mechanized world. And I began to think about how, really a lot of these technologies are coming in the 1950s while Disney's being created, coming from the assembly line. The word automation is coined in 1952 in the popular language.
Oh, okay.
And there's a huge concern in the years following. There was basically 3 congressional hearings on automation the year Disneyland opened and the years following, because they were so concerned about what automation would do to the American workforce. Because when you replace workers with machines, no one's making money to feed the economy, and this is going to be a problem.
Huh.
These were the weird, strange concerns that, the 1950s had, that they're clearly wrong about this.
Never heard those before. Oh, yeah. Nobody's ever thought about that. Weird.
And so these were a lot of the things, and it became even more interesting then to then think about what is sort of this park targeted toward middle-class audiences in a world where automation has really become, like, to the point that some companies said you will not use automation to describe our practices because that's a bad word.
Ooh.
And so there really was this moment where, you have this amusement park that is created on the backbone of automation technologies, and something that gets continued sort of heightened as the park matures in an era where the number one fear was getting blown up by nuclear weapons, and second to that, automation. And so that's really where the project sort of emerged. And a lot of it came from an early realization that the Peter Pan ride, where you get to fly over London,
Yep.
that is literally to this day basically a warehouse conveyor that is used in many warehouses in the Ford factory to basically move heavy items. And they basically just copied and pasted it from like sales catalogs and created an attraction out of it. And so what becomes most interesting and what I explore in this book is also the ways in which particular modes of the assembly line are being, for lack of a better word, aestheticized, but being presented to audiences through sort of these cartoon characters. And my argument in this book is really that the theme park is the only space where Americans who are not working in a factory get to experience like the full brunt of the assembly line. To this day, I think that's still the case. We hear about assembly lines. You can take a factory tour of an assembly line if you really are,
Sure.
If you're at the Ford factory and you're into that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But we really don't have a sense of what these technologies are or what they do beyond these sort of vague stereotypes. And I think that the theme park is the only place where you can really immerse yourself in those technologies. Except rather than those technologies manufacturing a product, it's actually you who are that product being moved around.
Okay, a lot to unpack here. So, but like I'm thinking about too, like what you just mentioned, and I'm thinking about, like, you mentioned the herky jerkiness of the ride, like having been to Disney World a couple times, to Disneyland in California, like it's a small world, like just the way that things turn, the way that boats move, like there's a very conscious kind of movement style to it, which just kind of brought back all sorts of childhood memories, which we don't need to unpack now. I'll deal with those elsewhere on some other forum. But also too, like the way that, automation is handled now, like you were saying, it seems absolutely right to me, is that I'm thinking not just of kind of tours of like the Ford factory or anything like that, but many people have gone on like brewery tours or distillery tours, or kind of like those types of tours in which there is a certain amount of automation. Everything's kind of behind glass, like you kind of watching the process maybe a little bit, but it seems very abstract. And being in those theme parks, you are the product, as you said, right? Like you're being moved through something in order to produce a certain result, right? You become, I mean, like capitalism, I guess, or something.
Well, the funny part is that in the dark rides, which is basically a ride in a darkened building on a track. So, Peter Pan is an example of a dark ride. Snow White is an example of a dark ride, for anyone familiar.
Space Mountain, I would assume.
Space Mountain goes into the roller coaster category,
right,
but it is a sort of hybrid of the dark ride with the roller coaster. It was actually a really fascinating sort of conversation that happened early on, because Disney, the idea was that in all their dark rides, you, the rider, were the main character. And it created all sorts of confusion, because that meant that you didn't get to see the main character in the ride because you were the main character.
Right.
And so Snow White was particularly infamous for this because it doesn't follow the narrative of the movie. And you're just basically being stalked by the evil witch the entire time because, surprise, you're Snow White.
Yeah.
So there's some great comments about like annoyed grandpas getting off the ride and being like, where the hell is Snow White? And that was terrifying. The kids were screaming the whole time, which I think in some ways really literalizes the idea that, what you're being sort of constructed as is the main character in this story. Like you really are being sort of produced at the end of that experience so that you are Peter Pan, you are Snow White, you are Mr. Toad on his wild ride. So there was weird ways in which there was almost like a literalism in how they were thinking about those attractions that created all sorts of confusions that had to be remedied decades later.
And how are those confusions resolved, right? Because the thing that I'm thinking about too is about the representation kind of the rider,
Yeah.
right? As opposed to like participating in the story of the ride. This is also all happening, right, as TVs are becoming much more popular in the United States. So like people are engaging visually in this medium in a much more immersive way. Like, was there a connection? Am I just kind of like connecting two things that are sort of happening at the same time in some way, or is there some sort of connection there?
Oh, no, there's definitely connections there. Disney explicitly sold the idea of the theme park as basically a TV set that they would
Mm,
film their television show. And Disney very much used through the Disneyland television show, used it as a way of sort of showcasing the construction of the park. And basically, that whole idea of secrecy and like concealment and like Disney doesn't want you to know
yeah.
how they make their things. That's sort of antithetical to how Disney worked. He was giving people constantly a sort of progress report on how the park was going to drum up excitement for the park. And what we see in this period, and it sort of applies to amusement parks more generally, is that because of the popularity of television, amusement parks actually presented what many sort of industry leaders refer to as sort of an unmediated experience.
Mm.
You could actually go and do things outside in a way that was engaging, in a way that television was not really allowing you to do. And so while movie theaters were suffering because it was another form of mediated entertainment, but then you had to drag yourself out of your house, amusement parks were actually doing quite well in that period, contrary to a lot of popular belief, because it offered that type of sort of immersive experience that you really couldn't get from television or from conventional movie theaters. And so it really was a moment where a lot of sort of the introduction of television and really its proliferation, as well as sort of the broader sort of suburbanization that happened after World War II, really were sort of encouraging these types of desires to like go to amusement parks and have these real life experiences that you couldn't have in sort of conventional spaces.
But also within that, like
Mhm.
this is just kind of firing all sorts of questions in my head right now. So, and then also impossible, I would think, without the massive expansion of the automobile
Mhm.
with the highway system, like being able to go to
Yeah.
these theme parks, right? Like that's a really important kind of thing. And allowing people to kind of get to these places in ways that they might not have been able to otherwise. You could stay at home, like you said, in your own town and go to a movie theater or something like that, but going to these things and actually doing something, that must have been a strong part of that appeal as well.
Yeah, completely. And definitely sort of the private automobile was a game changer in this because I think amusement parks have always been sort of on the outskirts of cities,
Mhm.
accessible through like trolleys and things like that. But the sort of culture under which Disneyland in particular emerged was very much so targeted for the idea that very careful studies were done to see where the highway systems were going and where it would make sense to locate the amusement park, where there would be enough room for development and that it would still be accessible because of the highway system.
Yeah.
So it was very much created for this sort of mobile middle class family that would have access to these spaces.
So with the initial concern at the same time, kind of generally within the country to the rise of automation, was there a willingness for people to experience what Disney was kind of selling at that moment? Like you mentioned, for example, like, old men getting off and saying like, where the heck was Snow White in the Snow White ride? So like kind of, but more than that, like the mechanization of what they were experiencing being a different experience than maybe other theme parks that they had been to, or amusement parks, I should say, having been in the past.
Yeah, I think that that's one of the most interesting things, especially in the earlier chapters of the book. One of the things that I chart is, amusement parks have always been associated as spaces of mechanization. The Coney Islands, all these things were
Mhm.
places that drew attention precisely because of the machine. And what begins to happen over the early course of the 20th century is that the machine is no longer a spectacle
Mhm.
in the way that it was before. It becomes more of a deterrent in a sense. Like you really want to begin to obfuscate the machine because there's nothing new to that.
So you need to hide the
Yeah,
machine.
there's
Yeah.
more of a
Okay.
desire that like what is perhaps more sort of sublime, as one person called it, is the sort of chance encounter with a ride that is not sort of like blatantly saying, look, I'm a ride.
Huh.
The idea that therefore the machine is allowing you a unique experience rather than just being the machine for the sake of the machine. And that's where you can think of like, the big wooden roller coasters, all these strange devices
Mhm.
that sort of populate your imagination of a sort of early 20th century Coney Island. And so I think that that's really what becomes really interesting in this period is that you then have this desire to produce different types of experiences through these machines. And what starts to happen early on is that because of automation and all the developments that are happening in this period, what these machines can do become more and more powerful. And so you begin to have a very quick adaptation, like systems and technology get introduced for like the assembly line 1 year, and then maybe 2 or 3 years down the line, you have Disney already translating this into an amusement attraction. And that is a sort of history that continues to this day, which is really interesting. And I don't think anyone ever is sitting there being like, that's an automation technology. No one's sitting there being like, we're on an assembly line.
Yeah, yeah.
But what is fascinating is, I think, precisely that divide that happens, that sort of ability for us to sort of segment these two sort of parts of these worlds and to say this is leisure and this is labor, and yet they're sort of created through the same sort of systems.
Sure.
And that's actually something that I think writers in the early 20th century, when these transformations are happening from sort of the obviousness of the machine to sort of its getting pushed down below the surface, was really this idea that machines were inescapable and that now people who were burdened by work with the machine would then go and find their leisure activities in the machine. And that there was sort of like an odd, sort of cruel element to that.
Yeah. But still, it seems like a kind of a consciousness about that anxiety, if I'm understanding you correctly, in that the automation of the ride itself needed to be hidden in some way. It shouldn't be immediately obvious that, as you were saying, whereas, it's not the spectacle of the machine, it's just it's something that happens that Disney didn't want you to think about as you were experiencing that event. And that led me to another question, which maybe brings us back sort of to the Middle Ages a little bit, is that, one of the things that scholars, medievalists have written about is kind of the medievalism of Disney, is that a lot of the themes are set kind of in the past or like in a fairy tale. There's an escapist element to a lot of, the stories of Snow White and, the castle and all that kind of stuff of Cinderella, etc. Like, does that figure into your analysis at all? Like, does that seem to be because like the theme or the tension, I should say, of pre-modernity as the subject that you're witnessing and the very modern experience that you're having in the space?
Yeah, there is certainly, and this is something that is very evidently on their minds. Early documents actually even like sort of correct themselves, and you have some scratching out of like certain phrases that are, the park is about, the struggles that have made America and also the enduring challenges of the present. And then it's like, no, 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 let's not talk about challenges of the present. It's really about the optimism of the future. And that's very much so like when you think about sort of these lands, which are Adventureland, Frontierland, Fantasyland, and then Tomorrowland.
Hmm.
For the most part, these are sort of places that are set in sort of a historical moment. Even Fantasyland, which of course is fantasy, is very much often rooted on these very sort of medievalizing ideas
Hmm.
from the castle to the individual attractions there. And so there is very much this notion of the past as part of this escapist fantasy, and one that in many ways feeds directly into the future. And I think what's perhaps most interesting about Disneyland in these types of dynamics is that there is no present.
Hmm.
You find sort of every historical moment at Disneyland except the present.
Huh.
It is
Yeah.
really a sort of space where you might be walking down Main Street, which is the turn of the century, or you are in Frontierland. You're in all these different lands and spaces that are explicitly not now. And that is explicitly stated when you enter the park, where it says, here you leave today. And so there is this idea that everything exists there except the present. And that disjuncture, I think it's a willful avoidance of the challenges.
Oh, sure.
And I think it comes out of sort of this early Cold War mentality of thinking about, it's all the sort of stereotypical things you could think about, but I think there's really this idea of like, there are a lot of problems facing the country in the moment, but there's also this idea of like, everything's great. And it's this almost like, guys, no, everything's great. We're just going to say everything's great.
Everything was great. Everything will be great.
Yeah.
Don't worry about today.
In some ways it becomes a sort of very sort of smart device for really avoiding what is happening in the world by saying,
sure,
this is truly escapist because you can literally do anything except exist in the present. And I think that that's something that is quite interesting because I think in many ways it was effective. And I think one of the things that's most intriguing to me about this question of automation is not so much that the idea that anyone in the park in 1955 was thinking, these are automation machines and we're going through these struggles. I think in some ways having Disneyland rides made out of assembly line technologies was a way of learning to not see automation. It was almost teaching you to ignore it. It created this sort of double bind where it's here, but it's not. This is technologies of labor, but no, they're not because this is a place of leisure. And I think that's probably one of the most interesting aspects. It really sort of helped to, I think in some ways, assuage certain fears, when suddenly your scary technologies that you read about in the newspaper are sort of cloaked in your favorite characters. And it also helped to make them less intimidating in many ways. And I think there is a personification of these technologies that happens at different periods, whether you're thinking about the creation of animatronics and the long history of automata that we have, or just simply in, the jerks of your car or your boat on It's a Small World that sort of speak to this broader computerized logic of how that something is watching you and making sure that things are neatly spaced, that the world is operating in this orderly fashion.
And assuaging those concerns by aiming them at children as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's child's play. Yeah.
It's child's play, and it comforts them so they grow up with those types of things, right? Or those types of experiences.
And I think it also creates that great slippage where, like, if you now associate the movements of the assembly line with your Disneyland vacation, it makes the assembly line a lot more exciting and intriguing. And I think that's interesting from our perspective to think about this when we have shows like Unwrapped or How It's Made, all these shows that were very popular, particularly in the early 2000s, that really sort of fed on this idea that, we were interested in these sort of secret worlds of technology and machines and like what actually happens in an assembly line. And I think that's just so the case today with, whether we're talking about a Tesla Gigafactory or an Amazon fulfillment center. There's this continued history that continues here.
And a continued fascination, just to kind of bring it back to what we were talking about earlier, a continued fascination with process, right? Like how things are done and unraveling those things back to secrets that are revealed, tying things up in a nice little bow here at the end. So we are unfortunately kind of running out of time here. It's been a real pleasure. Real quick question at the end. You mentioned, do you have a favorite land within Disney?
That's a hard one.
You can say no, but
I think I'm not a favorites person.
Okay.
And so that's challenging.
You love them all equally.
I think Fantasyland in many ways embodies what Disney is in some ways. So I guess that would be a lazy answer. But I think it is really, it's such a small park. It's sort of, they're all equal.
Okay, fair enough. So there was always something enchanting for me about when I visited about Tomorrowland and just kind of the kind of zip zappiness of their vision of the future. So, and then we haven't even talked about kind of like Epcot and the way that they kind of thought about that type of thing afterwards. But we'll do that at some other time. We'll have another conversation. So thank you so much for joining us. This has been a real pleasure. Thank you again for Roland. Roland, can you just remind us again the name of your book, when it's going to come out, so everybody can look for it when it does?
Yes. So the title of the book is Disneyland and the Rise of Automation: How Technology Created the Happiest Place on Earth. And it will be out in April
of 2026. And if anybody wants to learn more about your work, kind of generally, how can they find you on the internet?
I am Prof. Betancourt on most places, including Instagram and X. And you can also just Google me, and you can usually find, my writings and stuff online.
Excellent. Well, I'm sure people will be looking for them soon. So thank you again for joining us for another episode of American Medieval. Our guest today has been Roland Betancourt. Thank you again, Roland, and we'll see you guys next week. Take care. Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and this episode was edited by Julia Schiffini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/American Medieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.